So you've probably heard the old adage, first comes love, then comes marriage, and then comes a baby in a baby carriage. But let's not talk about the baby right now. Um, Marriage in and of itself, we've kind of already hinted at it to some extent and looked at how sex and marriage were viewed together and separately. But in particular, looking at the social construction of marriage, um, sociologists, social science, anthropologists, our research shows that the emergence of marriage isn't quite the fairy tale that most of us believe it is. That in particular, marriage emerged out of the patriarchy property model, where marriage served economic and political functions in particular that benefit men and was completely unrelated to love and happiness. It was more of a transaction, right? And in your text, they even point out that this was really true for white families and that marriage was a form of property ownership. So, in particular, if an unmarried woman was raped, then the main concern wasn't about the woman necessarily, but it was about her father's property, right? And so, as you look at the current events, current issues that we struggle with as a society when it comes to women's bodies and their sexual restriction on their agency and freedom, you can see the precursors, right? The predecessors and the precursors for those um, issues here in this patriarchy property model. And unfortunately, even once we get into the 1900s, these non romantic functions of marriage were still very evident in the form of relationships between men and women and between those who work and those who did not. So, industrialization, for example, broke up that traditional family that we started to see with the agrarian um, societies and shifted the power from husbands and fathers to the employer. And this is a really interesting way of looking at one's household, that instead of there being a head of household within the home, that perhaps now the head of household has shifted to one's employer, right? What do you think of that? I'm really interested in that concept, in that idea. That the power shifted from husbands and fathers to employers, and that capitalists were quite pleased with hiring women and children. One, because of competition, they could pay them less, right? So they were fine with being able to hire women and children as cheap labor. And since men's wages were super low, especially as they hired more women and children and people of color, the families actually needed to have all of these different lines of income. However, labor unions, as much as I love a union today, not all of their plights have been innocent and neutral in their pursuit. So, in particular, those consisting of white men drew laws to reduce competition. Who are they reducing the competition from? Well, from people of color for sure. You've probably already heard about that. Barring men of color and women of color from certain jobs in certain arenas. But also, a lot of the ideas about child labor restriction or about gender restrictions that seems somewhat benevolent actually was about cutting down on competition. And so it wasn't like, oh, we love our kids so much, let's save them from, you know, um, from the dangers of the factory, or let's let them have a childhood. These things didn't exist. There was no concept of this childhood thing at this point. So instead, what they fought for was something called a family wage. And the family wage is an income that's paid to a man that's large enough to support a home, a wife, children, a family, right? And oy vey, this was problematic because that meant that if there was a family wage, you actually could pay women and children even less because their incomes were viewed as being supplementary. One of my main issues with our situation today is that we are still running off of this idea of a family wage, that there is still this expectation that if you're choosing to have a family or have children in particular, that there's going to be somebody who's available to stay at home. There's a lot of evidence pointing to that, that we are still expecting that women will do that private sphere labor for free, or in exchange of being able to depend on a man's family wage. Or the idea that, um, oh, sorry, I got lost. The idea that um, women um, will be earning only supplementary incomes, that they'll be working part time, or that they don't need their own health insurance and things like that. Despite, evidence uh, uh, of the opposite being true, we still see that we are very much set up to have this family wage, but that the family wage no longer exists. People no longer get paid enough to cover an entire family, right? Much less themselves sometimes. Um, and so, I mean, but we still set up as our society in ways that if you want to get things done, if you want to run errands or have your kids go to school, there's this expectation, at least while your kids are young in particular, that somebody's going to be at home, right? And who is expected to be at home? Most likely, women. Another thing that pops up is the breadwinner housewife marriage. And while that is not a legal form of subordination, um, really the rights and responsibilities of men and women, of husbands and wives, were defined very differently. And women owed men domestic services in this idea. They were expected to be housewives, and men were like required and sometimes legally required to support their wives financially and to be providers. We don't have that today, but that expectation still remains. And then we saw that the stronger the labor union, the stronger the breadwinner housewife marriage. And to some extent, we saw that in women being considered to, like, their job being considered to raise their children, and that paying a man a wage would include the wage for women raising their children. Last, we have here the cult of domesticity. And this is a notion that women could and should wholeheartedly embrace the world of making a loving home. And that if they didn't, there was something unnatural or wrong with them, that they were hysterical, that they were lesbians, whatever, that they maybe were witches. I don't know. Like, there have been so many ridiculous claims about women, and in particular women who did not want to follow gender norms and roles, that have led to them being burned on a stake or at a cross. I mean, I laugh because it's just so ridiculous. Um, or to being viewed as being, at the time, sexually deviant in some way, or as having an entire mental and physical illness. All because women weren't adhering to this cult of domesticity. They didn't want to be necessarily domestic workers. And we're starting to see a revival of that, which is pretty frightening, on like TikTok and social media. And I haven't run to it personally in my algorithm, But I've heard that it's one of the most highly viewed areas of TikTok, and I am frightened. I am shooketh. I digress. So my last stop here is going to be looking at the funny 50s, um, and explaining why it's considered to be the funny 50s. Primarily, it's because it was just this weird time during which the decades prior and the decades following were a lot less conservative than the 1950s. This is after World War II. This is where like the GIs are coming home. They are getting, at least the white guys are getting these amazing like FHA loans. The middle class is emerging as a result. The US is booming economically speaking. The American dream is alive. And as a result, we also have the Cold War that's beginning, or the Red Scare, and also some fear mongering, not only when it comes to the Soviets and the threat of nuclear war, but also when it comes to people returning to their places, knowing one's place and going back to it. Think about it during World War II. There was a lot of segregation. Men were off fighting in the war. Women who remained were entering the workforce now, and also, in the company of other women. And so a lot of people, both on the front lines in the fights, but also on the home front, found themselves in the company of the same gender. And so we started to see that there was a lot more homoerotic encounter. I'm going to also say homosexual encounter, that it wasn't just eroticism, but also the feeling of, um, I guess, more leniency, um, of easier access to homosexual activity, behaviors, and relationships. Um, and so we see a crackdown on homosexuality in the United States starting in the 1950s. We see a strong effort to defend the like nuclear family with gender specific family roles as well. And the government itself, right? Not just like the public, religious, sectors, the market, the newspapers, but even the government was involved in this crisis of the nuclear family, of the breadwinner housewife family. And you can see that reflected in the television programming of the day. And again, think about like the 1920s, the 30s, the 40s, and how much integration there was sexually, and just like how much things were changing and altering and progressing. And then think about how much the 1950s kind of felt like this weird regression. So we saw in a lot of ways crackdowns on same gender dancing and cross dressing, cities passing laws that alcohol couldn't be sold to those who were thought to be gay or lesbian or homosexuals in some way. Um, there's actually uh, a like homosexual crisis kind of stated with the lavender scare, where basically a moral panic was started about homosexuality as a threat to the heterosexual family. um, so yeah, it was a lot, you all. The 1950s were a lot. um, and there was this big push to uh, get homosexual activity like weeded out, and to again tell everyone to go back to their place and go back to doing their things. The question, however, as always, is why the lavender scare? Why this focus on homosexuality? in the 1950s.